This is a quick summary of a session I put together for colleagues at PA around disrupting learning and development. So I'm going to cover three areas: some of the basic concepts, some examples, and then how to do learning design. So before we start, how would you do the following things? If you wanted to find something to do over the weekend, if you wanted to find a new recipe, if you wanted to find your way to an unfamiliar place or figure out how to use Prezi or maybe use your new phone, how would you do those things? Chances are that classroom and e-learning didn't feature in the sorts of response you gave. So you might actually just use trial and error, you might just do things, or you might look things up, Google or YouTube. So classroom and e-learning are two things that are broken. They're broken for organisations, they're not working. So classroom is seen as costly, ineffective, but it's liked. People like it generally because they like to get together. E-learning is seen as cheap, but ineffective and disliked, and is generally used for compliance. So both those things not really working. Why? Well, here's one explanation, or one part of the reason why: the learning elimination curve. Basically, the premise of both classroom and e-learning is that somehow you are going to use those experiences to store information in your head. And frankly, people just don't work like that. We've known that for a long time, and people forget almost everything that they experience. So it's really a waste of time and money. So what do people do instead? Well, if you actually look at what people do, they tend to look things up as they go. And so the learning elimination curve really just reflects this, that the closer you can get to the point of need, the less money and time you will waste actually trying to deliver small amounts of information. The same three things that you might forget from a course several weeks ago, you can look up right now, and it's much more efficient. If you don't believe me, here's an example which sort of brings it into focus. This was my first computer. Have a look at the manuals on the top of the computer. You had to learn all that stuff before you could really get anything out of it. This is an iPad, of course. Notice that it doesn't come with any manuals at all, and you can actually do a lot more. So learning has been eliminated from this device. So probably organisations today look a lot like this computer. People join them and it's fantastically difficult to actually get to use them or do anything productive with them. So the challenge is, what if we could make organisations a little bit more like the iPad, and how would we do that? Well, learning elimination is a lot like UX. It's just about good design. So what does learning modernisation or learning maturity really look like? Well, it's really quite straightforward. It's a shift of two stages, from courses to resources and from resources to guidance. So the first step is around no longer expecting people to hold loads of information in their heads, but just providing them with kind of useful resources that support them as they're doing the job. And the second step is actually going one step further, building in contextualised information the way that SatNav does, and actually giving them guidance that they can use in the moment. If you don't believe me, a good book to read is the Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande, which sort of highlights the fact that resources can have much more of an impact in the workplace than do courses. One of the mistakes people often make, I find, in this area is they confuse resources with just breaking courses into smaller pieces, or so-called micro-learning. Micro-learning is a really bad idea. It's basically the premise that if something was useless when it was big, if you break it into smaller pieces, it suddenly becomes useful. And that doesn't work. Here's a good example of a resource. It is not learning content. So at no point do I try to memorize this. Nevertheless, it's a useful resource. I use it several times a week, and it improves my performance measurably. So that's what a resource looks like. And just to highlight the difference, there's a big difference between content dumping using technology, which is taking content, breaking it into really small pieces, or micro-learning, and then sort of spewing it out at people in the expectation that somehow they'll memorize it, and performance support, which is about understanding what it is that people are trying to do and then building resources which will actually enable them to do that. The first doesn't really work. The second can work fantastically effectively. In fact, the second is what we do when we Google or YouTube things. So what makes for a good resource? Well, the good news is it's got nothing to do with instructional design. You can pretty much forget instructional design, which is kind of modern day alchemy. Never really succeeded in turning anything into gold. Instead, focus on UX, or design and utility. Basically, those are the only two things that you have to worry about. Is the thing you're creating really well designed, and is it really useful? But it turns out those are much harder to do than people perhaps imagine. If you're interested in the area of kind of design and utility, no better book than Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things. Here's an example that I'm familiar with. When I worked at Siemens many years ago, we introduced this. It was a tablet computer, and it bombed. But have a think about that. It was a really useful thing. It could do many of the things that a modern day iPad could do, but it failed because it was just really, really poorly designed. So design is much more important than people imagine, but the opposite is true. You can do something which is beautifully designed. I see lots of organizations got beautifully designed websites. Nobody's using them. They wonder why. Because they're not useful. You've dumped a load of content on there. It's beautifully designed, but it's not useful. So what do we do instead then if classroom and e-learning aren't working? So instead of classroom, we do experiences or experience design. You can design an experience that people will learn from without dumping content. And instead of e-learning, you build resources. You understand what people are trying to achieve, and then you build resources that help them achieve those things. So what are the things that are out and what are the things that are in? E-learning is out. Instead, performance support. Modules, no. Instead, resources. Learning objectives, no. Even if you achieve learning objectives, it probably won't change behavior. And actually changing behavior generally happens without learning. So performance outcomes is where we need to go. Blending, maybe not. I'll come back to that. Courses, no. Resources and experiences, as we'll see in a minute. SME, not so much. Audience focus is what UX is all about. 70-20-10, we'll see in a minute. Instructional design, no, you can forget it. UX, much more accessible, really works. Waterfall, no, as a methodology. Agile works much better because you can involve your audience in the process. Sign off, no. MVP or minimum viable product, again, works much better. Learning content, no. Useful stuff, yes. In fact, people tend not to actually use learning content just because it's called learning. They assume that because it's called learning, it will be useless, which is a kind of rather sad reflection of where we got to. So instead of learning content, erase learning, put useful stuff instead. T&A, training needs analysis, not so much. Audience analysis, yes. Completion, maybe if you're in the regulatory space, but if you're really interested in learning and resources, then usage is much better. If you're familiar with 70-20-10, this is how these things fit across the spectrum. So 10% e-learning modules and classroom events, and the LMS kind of typically involved there. And then social media, line manager and assignments, yes, very much drive learning. But the new opportunity is top left, online learning with the sorts of things, portals, apps, Google, YouTube, that are really going to help people to get their jobs done day to day.